What I want to look at doing here is to upgrade true ambience gel lighting to incorporate hypertextures to get more light output out of the gel. Previously this was achieved by stacking the gels on top of one another, but this was render inefficient because transparency layers used extra ray paths up. So I've just got this scene as a simple object that I made in Wings 3D and an infinite plane. They're both in the default grey material and we've got default lighting. First thing I'm going to do is turn the atmosphere off, set it to fully black. I've got ambient output, I will be using that, but I've also got other things happening in the Skylab, so let's just check in here. I want to turn the sunlight off, so I'm just going to disable the sunlight, and I don't really need any shadows cast, so I could disable the sun and moon shadows, and then I'll know that that won't be using up any extra render time if it does. So at this point what I should have is a fully black scene, and if I don't, then I have to be suspicious that I got atmospheric effects, but I've got the atmosphere off, so that's not going to happen, or sky dome colour, which is something that can pollute your scenes. So I'm just going to make sure that that's set to fully zero, not even any slight values in there. And as I say, the global ambient colour here is what I'm going to use to drive my effects. I'm going to turn that up to its maximum setting, and at this point I'm going to introduce a light source. So create a light source here and enlarge it, but not massively. You can see how things stand at the moment, but we're going to be using true ambient rendering, so I'm going to change the render options. I'm going to the render options here, select premium effects. I'll set it down to 4 rays per pixel for previewing, select true ambience. I want true ambient scatter correction selecting and boost light selecting, so those want to be checked, that wants to be checked, and I'm going to reduce the maximum ray depth here to 4, so that will ensure that I'm not using any extra paths up that I don't need to. If I go lower than that, then it can start to interfere with the effect. So I'll check out of that now and give that a quick render. Okay, it's only rendering in seconds, and you can see we've still got a mixture of direct lighting and true ambience lighting. So this light source now wants to be modified so that it's going to be a light output for our true ambience effect. So I'm going to edit the light source. I'm not going to use this feature, so they're set to 0. Select it for true ambience optimization, use gel, and then modify the procedural, reset it to default grey, turn the diffuse down to 0, and turn the ambience up. So I've got full ambient output now. Check out of there, check out of there, and you'll see now that the inside of this light source, which we can see through, which is fine, is lighting this area in a sort of generally grey way. Now the importance of being able to see through this light source is that when it comes to enlarging it so it encompasses the entire scene, we can still do things like have a backdrop. So I'm going to use a HDRI image that comes with this product of horrors in mind, which is a garage HDRI image. So I'll just load that one in, and I'm only going to be using that as a background so I can reflect it off the object. So if I go into the Skylab now, image based lighting, use HDRI image, open, I'll select the medium resolution version. It's low enough resolution not to have a high memory footprint, but it's high enough resolution to be suitable for reflecting off objects. I'll set the intensity up to 12, turn the quality down, turn the specularity off, turn the HDRI effect off, and then use as backdrop, add to sky, and now it should be ready to do a bit of a render with this. So now everything's set up. It doesn't matter about shadow casting because I'm not going to use it as a light source. These are set to 0. So if I render now, you'll see that there's a bit of a high noise area outside our light source. Then the light source, there's none of this noise getting into it. And this is an important feature of using radial light and setting the default grey, because that makes it a solid material, so the true ambience can't see through the surface. We can from the camera, but that's a different matter. So this true ambience light gathering process stops at the surface of the sphere. So if at this point I modify the mesh material and the plane together, and I'll just give it 15 reflection, so they can see now the effect of having the reflective surfaces. So that immediately makes these look metallic, and what I'm going to do, you can see that it's not looking bad inside here. It looks a bit strange, admittedly, because if I was to do a higher quality render of this, you might get an idea what's going on. I tend to get used to seeing things when in a sort of very low resolution format when I preview them. But if I just let this render, what's it going to be? I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes, then you'll see the effect of the cutoff from the light source and these highlights coming through the reflection. And because the high dynamic range image has not been tone mapped, so the reflections, it's just suppressing everything essentially except the brightest elements in the scene, because it's only 15 reflection in the material option, so we're seeing the fluorescent lights and perhaps a bit of overspill around those. So this is an interesting effect, I think, but perhaps not a very useful one. And what you might also notice is that there's not quite enough light to light this object in the scene. So what I want to do is produce a hypertexture that's going to boost my output for the ambient on the surface of the light source, so I can produce enough light to light this properly. And then after I've done that, then what I shall do is look at taking the effect a bit further, because you can utilize that to increase the contrast in the transient render mode, so you can sort of exaggerate the effect. So you can see this is it's looking okay at the moment. I'll just stop the render there and then modify this material. So I'll select my radial light, modify the material for this light, and in here I want my hypertexture. So I'll just follow the method that I have done in the other videos, and if I go a bit fast about these hypertextures, then you probably should look at one of the earlier videos before you dive in and come to this. So I'll put a blob in here, press shift and click on the name, go to basic, select this check blue function here, and then go into here, turn off the colour and the bump, we don't need those, and because we're not using bump I don't need to worry about the mapping mode. Click on these corner blobs to get some controls open, select noise, I want in the type, I want the one at the very bottom, distance squared, I want the mode to be set to minimum, octaves 1, and this frequency I set to -1. So there you go. That has created a hypertexture output. This output though is highly negative, and what I want is a positive version of this. So if I drag this component over to the next component, change this combine here, the blend mode to difference, and then any one of these I just make it a nothing value. So if I go up here and go nothing, and I just set the octaves down to 0 because I don't want to do any extra work than it needs to, then this output, although it looks the same, stripy value is just indicating it can't really display what we're producing here, this difference effect means this is a highly positive output. If I check out of here now, you see the ambient output suddenly boosted to the point where it's looking fully white. And that's what I was looking for. So this output now is extremely high. So high in fact that I'll probably have to use alpha scaling for the first stages of this and set it down to a low level. So let's try 0.1 there. Still looks extraordinarily bright. I mean, it wouldn't do if it was under normal circumstances, but this output's really boosting it from the hypertexture. So that's very high output now, and probably you can see in the preview there, because I've got this set to accurate rendering, which shows the transient rendering effect, that it's all gone a bit too bright. So in render options I'll just set this back down to 4 so we can preview this, and then I'll modify the global ambient colour now down to see if we can just get it into a level where we can see what's going off. So got so much output to work with now. So it's a bit brighter than it was before. Perhaps that's a reasonable level of brightness. And what I'm going to do at this point is enlarge the light source so it encompasses the entire scene, so it's huge. Then we can just concentrate on what we've got here. So at this point you can see that it's pretty well lit, even though the global ambient colour is set very low. However, there's another thing we can do here. So if I just select a small area so you can get an idea what's going on. So I'll use 64 again. Let's see, select this area here. So I've got a fair range of things to look at. So I'm just going to let that render briefly. And you can consider here this inner edge. This is like a shadow region. The light's obviously, when it's doing its light gathering, not gathering very much into this corner because of what's around it. You know, it's not seeing the light source which is wrapped around the scene, it's tended to see the surface of the model. Now, for some reason, possibly to do with the way that the effect is clamped mathematically when it's doing its light gathering, you can force the contrast up by increasing the lighting and reducing the diffuse response of the material. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to take the lighting, and as I was before, I'm going to turn the ambience right up so you can see, you know, there's a lot of light. I'm just going to set the raise pixel down again to set this up. So it might take a few goes. So I've selected the mesh and the plane, go into the material for this, and modify the diffuse down to a low level, and hold the Alt key down, click on the colour swatch and set it to 1. So this is dark and this is scaling it very dark. So at this point now, okay, it's gone a bit too far. So let's, so as I say, it probably takes a few goes to get this to be in enough light to light it. Let's try that. That's too much. Okay, let's try 50. Okay, that's about the right range. Now I'll just go back to where I was before, render options, 64 rays per pixel, and you should see here, that's what I was discussing before, that in this inner edge now, it seems to be getting even less light, even though the other grey areas are just as light. So what's happened is that the overall contrast in the scene has been increased by this method, which I thought creates quite a nice effect. So what I'm going to do is just provide a little bit more light to this by modifying the diffusion. There we go. So you can see you can't really preview it in here. And then I'm going to set this up for a final render. So we'll set it to 256 rays per pixel, and we'll see what the render time is likely to be. So it's true ambient render, and there's no direct light sources, so it's all done by the light gathering indirect lighting method. So that's probably quite an efficient way to use it, but it's still going to take a while to render out. So the prediction is here about 3/4 of an hour. So what I'll do is I'll let this render out, and that'll be the image for the video, or at least one of the images for the videos, because as with all effects, it's possible to take them a bit too far. And although this looks like a nice effect, in actual fact it's probably already gone a bit too far, and I'll explain it in this way. Right, so what we've got here, we'll get rid of the reflection because that's just confusing matters, and I'm going to get rid of the HDRI backdrop, so I'll just switch the backdrop off so it needn't really be a concern of ours now, and lower the rays per pixel. So by removing reflection, it's just going to make it so much more efficient for rendering, so you'll be able to see what's going on. So this looks like a transient render, but in actual fact it's behaving more like ambient occlusion, and I'll demonstrate that by selecting the ground plane, here, and making the colour predominantly red. So if I make this predominantly red now, you would expect, under normal circumstances, there to be some colour transfer between this surface and this one. But the thing is, it's only the background that's counting, the gel light, because the gel light's so bright compared with these other surfaces. Indeed, it's possible to make the gel light even brighter. If you remember, we placed it under control of alpha scaling, so I can actually scale it up so it's tremendously bright. And in this case, well, you can see that it's created a very extreme contrast. If I modify these materials now, so if I make that 0.1 and I make this plane 0.1 as well, you'll get back to the stage where they can be separated out. You can see this is quite an extreme response. In fact, if I modify this back to RGB 111, okay, and then set the render options up to 256 and give that a quick render. Let's see what the render time is for this. 10 minutes. So I'll just let this render out, and then we'll go back to making a few modifications. So let's see what that looks like when it's rendered out. So that's that render completed. And perhaps another way of looking at this is you could also turn the maximum ray depth down, since there's no reflection to utilize it in this scene. And if I just render a small portion of this, you'll see that even with a maximum ray depth of 1, which means it's not really taking into account any of the other surfaces, it only matters what it sees first, which is in this case the background or this material, it doesn't really change the quality of the render. So as I say, it's looking very much like the ambient occlusion. I'll just turn that back up again, and we'll swap things around a bit more. So for the final experiment, I just want to modify things back around again, and I'm going to start with ground plane and set that to an ordinary range, so diffuse fully red. So I'll have it fully red and just an ordinary level of diffusion, and I'll modify the mesh material back to default grey, and then I'm going to change the lighting setup. So if I edit this material on the light setup here, so I'll take this ambience and scale it back down again, and then change the light output here by modifying the global ambient down to a level where it's going to suppress it so that we can see what's going on. I'll give that a quick render now. It's going to take a while because I've got the rays per pixel set up for final rendering, so I'll take that down to 4 rays per pixel now. You can see that at this level, well, it's a bit bright because it's default grey, it's not really grey, the red on the ground is getting transferred onto the surface, so it's operating back in the light gathering mode where it's able to transfer colours from one surface to another, which is good. But there is yet another trick we can do. So I'm going to change the ground plane here. I'm just going to make it default grey for a second. In fact, I'm going to set it down in diffusion so it's quite dark. So I've got a dark ground plane there, and then I'm going to change the mesh material, so I'm going to do a hue shifting trick on it. So if I turn the red up and then turn the green down to sort of 60s level, there we go, then it looks reddish, but if it gets too much light it'll start to shift towards yellow. And this effect really works best without the boost light setting, though I might need a bit more light to push it further now. So you can see now that that looks yellow and red together. So if I give that a little bit more light, so I'll take that effect up to say 4, and I already know that I can to some extent increase the contrast in this by providing something to take light out, which is why I set the ground quite dark. And I'm going to bring the reflection back in because I think it might be nice to introduce in fact I'll take the diffusion right out so it's just a black surface, and then if you use metallicity it'll make it darker towards the camera. So I'm just setting this up for the final rendering really, and trying to do it fairly quickly because I've gone on for a while. So metallic, bit of reflection, so that's quite a dark surface underneath, so that'll tend to bring it down to red because it won't get much. You can just see a bit of reflection in there. Let's try some reflection on the mesh as well, and then I'll give it something to reflect. So we'll make that up to 15 there. It's going to increase the render time by adding the backdrop back in, because remember I took it out earlier, so it'll provide a bit of interest there. So I can see a bit of reflection on that. I think I shall take the reflection up on the plane. Let's try 50 in there, and if I set that, I set that up slightly. I'll give it some colour. There we go. So I've got a bit of interaction on the ground from the lighting, and this has got the hue shifting. At this point it might be worth just experimenting to see what effect reducing the rays down, so it'll just do a bit of interaction with the ground there. You can see that looks red because it's not fully reflecting the colours that are there, so the green's getting stretched back into its ordinary range. The light on it's pushed the green levels up so far, and then it dropped it down. So I'm going to lower this down so it's not so extreme. And this might be one occasion where it might also be worth just trying gamma correction out to see what effect that has. Nope, not so keen. Never really very keen on gamma correction. I know that some people have some success with it, but we've got the highlights here from the reflection to make up for the fact that it's not looking very bright now. We'll take that up. Modify the ground plane one last time. I'm just trying to decide what level I want that. I'll have that no colour in it and put that at the mid grey level that the default grey is, and give it a diffuse of 15, so it'll receive some light and also be still attenuating it somewhat. So there you go. I'll call this the end of the video because I've messed around long enough. So I just need to set this up so that it's going to render. I'll see how long it's going to take, but I suspect, let's take that up to value there. I suspect it is going to be about 45 minutes since I set the ray depth up again. So that's the end of the video then. I hope you found that interesting. You'll experiment with these effects in your own renders, and I'll put this image in with the opening frame so you can see how it turned out. So there you go.